This week, my coworkers Vlad Babkin and Chase Snyder join me to discuss the latest vulnerability disclosure from Eclipsium's research team, part 3 of what we call BMC&C. We'll discuss the details of the vulnerability as well as some recommendations for defense. Stay tuned. Below the Surface, coming up next. Welcome to Below the Surface, episode number 47, being recorded on Tuesday, March 18th, 2025. I'm your host, Paul Asadoorian, joined by Mr. Vlad Babkin. Vlad, welcome.
Hello there.
Vlad, you look like you're in a padded cell.
They have to contain me somehow.
That's right, somehow. Mr. Chase Snyder is here with us. Chase, welcome.
Hey, guys. Great to be back.
Yeah, good to have you. A quick announcement before we dig into it. Below the Surface listeners can learn more about Eclipsium by visiting eclipsium.com/go. There you'll find the ultimate guide to supply chain security, an on-demand webinar I presented called Unraveling Digital Supply Chain Threats and Risk, a paper on the relationship between ransomware and the supply chain, and a customer case study with DigitalOcean. If you're interested in seeing our product in action, you can sign up for a demo. All that at eclipsium.com/go. Fantastic. We're on round 3 of our disclosures for what we call BMC&C vulnerabilities in BMCs. I wanted to start first, and I know we've done this on other podcasts, but I thought it'd be nice to give people a refresher, define some terms. BMC, particularly Megarac and Redfish, and I know I've talked about this before, but I just very quickly, I'll take the BMC one, right? Baseboard Management Controllers. And many have heard me describe this as a, like you like computers so much, we put a computer inside your computer. It's essentially what it is, but it has this small computer that is for management of typically your servers, has these, what I call like at a high level, tentacles, right, into all the other parts of the server and intertwined in the hardware. So much so operating independently enough that one of the activities, as many of us well know, is you can connect to the BMC and perform maintenance, such as rebuilding the operating system, and still maintain that connection because the BMC operates independently. Vlad, Chase, how did I do with BMC? Good?
I would say yes.
Agree?
I think you nailed it. Also, the bleeping computer coverage of this exact story has a great image on top of it that illustrates the tentacles that you're talking about. It's like these little sort of like glowy matrixy lines that connect this BMC over to all the other things. Also love the computer in your computer meme.
Yeah, it's classic. It's classic. Yeah, us older folks. It was an old TV show. Vlad, I want to turn to you and just describe where AMI Megarac and Redfish come into this picture.
So AMI is a fairly famous vendor for BIOS for BMCs. Like if you saw American Megatrans logo when you boot your computer, you have a BIOS from AMI, and like there are quite a few places where you can see them. Like either your computer, or if you look at popular YouTubers who actually do some computer builds, you'll probably see when they boot the computer more than once, right? So this should give enough explanation what who AMIs are. And now what's Megarac? Megarac is their product they pretty much sell to vendors. So like imagine that you are, say, HP, right? And you don't really want to develop your own BMC, right? For a specific server. You go to AMI and you just buy their Megarac product, and now you can embed it into your system, right? So instead of writing it on your own, you pretty much just buy it off. And like, you can
Megarac's AMI's BMC specific firmware.
Yeah.
Largely produced for the chipsets that we're talking about are from a company called ASpeed, right? AST 2500, 2600. I think there's a 2700 as well, correct?
Not sure if 2700, but 2600 for sure.
2600. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
And those are like, basically ARM-based socks that run Linux, basically, is what we're talking about here.
Yep, pretty much that. And Redfish is a standardized API to manage BMC in general, not just Megarac. So it's pretty much described in a big standard. You can actually Google for it. So you will find definitions of how it looks like, multiple versions of it, etc., etc. So modern BMCs normally try to provide it because then you can use a single tool to integrate with all of them. You don't have to have a specialized tool for a lot of features. Sadly, it's not quite as universal as they pictured, but yeah.
Redfish is the API standard, right? That's typically implemented over like in any other kind of API over HTTP, HTTPS, whatever, right? Over those protocols. I kind of think of it similar to SNMP for managing like routers and switches, except this is a web API for managing BMCs. I draw some similarities there in the way you use it for management purposes, right?
Yep. It's pretty much just an API, just a way to access the BMC. And in this case, we are talking specifically about Redfish implementation in Megarac. So
right, because I believe I've seen Redfish be implemented in different firmwares using a different like web framework, right? Like some people will use, is it PHP? I'm not sure what some of the other ones are. But AMI, I believe, implemented it specifically in Lua. Is that true?
Mm-hmm. Yep, they have it in Lua. So their firmware has a bunch of languages. Megarac is implemented in Lua. Their primary web server with their web UI is implemented in C++, as far as I can tell. So, like, they have an interesting mix of stuff.
Right. And just to put it out there, AMI was great to work with in this disclosure process. They're very motivated to fix vulnerabilities and get patches out. So everyone's software has vulnerabilities, right? It's all in how you handle them. AMI did and continues to do a fantastic job on that front.
Yeah, so far they did 8 out of 8 from our perspective. So
well, because so being part 3, right? There's 8 total CVEs that we've disclosed. Particularly you, Vlad. I think you did the work on all 8 of these, correct?
Yep.
Yeah.
This was me in this case.
Right. So in terms of how we discovered it, were you just kind of continuing your previous research and continuing to look at the various entry points in the API?
More or less. So in this case, it's about having a reason to look into a fresh device. And in our case, we had a reason to do it. And I just looked into, oh, hey, I just gonna reverse engineer this firmware and just go ahead and take a look at Redfish yet again. So I know that previous ones were all patched, but I had a reason to actually try to look for more. So I just went ahead and did. So I'm not sure we can disclose why specifically we had that reason, but that doesn't really matter.
Sure, yeah. Convo. Yeah, that's fine. You were doing as part of your job, basically.
Yep, pretty much that.
So this vulnerability was interesting, and I remember when you first discovered it, and I was like, what other firmware is this in? And I started pulling apart some other firmware to look at and see, like, oh, it's in this firmware, it's in that firmware, and you'll see in the disclosure that we discovered a few different platforms that are using Megarac. Right now, they may or may not disclose they're using Megarac. This is very much a supply chain, situation here. But we had HPE's Cray systems, Asus, and ASRock rack devices, which I believe is ASRock's like server platform, as well as Asus server platform. Right, we're consuming this from AMI, and therefore also release patches. And you'll find that in the blog post. We put out a blog post today with all the I call gory details, right? Which includes the patches that are available. Lenovo also released a patch for their platform, so there are patches for several platforms available for this. And where else was I going with that? And so, but this vulnerability was interesting in terms of after I was reviewing it and thought about it, I'm like, this is really like a combination of an authentication bypass and a server-side request forgery. Do you agree with that, Vlad?
So I would say it's not really a classical server-side request forgery, but in this case, it's usually called header injection. So, but it's kind of on the intersection of things. So
yeah, it has a flair of header injection too. You're right. It's a weird, like, there's no one CWE that I think defines this one, right?
Yeah. So this one is kind of like the closest I can remember. It was Stack Overflow bug where somebody was setting x404 header by default to be 127.0.0.1, and Stack Overflow, by mistake, believed him to be an administrator because of this. So this one kind of has the exact same look and feel. I'm not sure if they appeared for the same reason, but external exploitation looks almost the same. So yeah. And as per details, well, so previous part, we had another header injection like this. So where if you put a special header value, it will do the same exact bypass which AMI patched, right?
Right.
But in this case, the vulnerability became a little bit technically more interesting because previously they just forwarded the header value. In this case, they actually didn't forward the exact value, but appended stuff to it. So it made it a little bit more interesting to actually find a way to trick the WAF code to actually trust it. So in this case, there is a light HTTPD server sitting in front of Lua implementation, and thus headers in between. So yeah, the question was how to manipulate the first one into making the second one trust the value. So
I see. Yep.
So what we did was pretty much find in Lua code that what it does, it splits value based on two dots. And that's it. Because it splits value based on two dots and takes the first part, we can actually put two dots in our header value. And that's it. Suddenly,
So you
we can fully
basically
control the value.
bypassing the filtering in this HTTP header field, the X server address ADDR, by basically looking at the regex and figuring out ways around the regular expression.
Yep. In this case, it was not very difficult, in my opinion. So what's fun is that this is almost the same exact bug as the previous part, just a different header. So this is like a patch bypass.
Right.
So yeah, I would say it has the same like the flair of SSRF, header injection, manipulating web server, like really hard to define it.
Yeah, for sure. And we basically an attacker would set the X server address header field to a 169.254 IP address, which is the default if you have DHCP enabled but don't get an IP address issued to you, or no?
No, that's not it. So BMCs provide a thing called Redfish host interface, where you can communicate with BMC itself from the host using Redfish.
Oh, right.
And if you activate this interface, this would be the IP address this interface is supposed to have.
I see. So it creates a local interface. Yeah.
Yes, they want to trust it by default, so that you can access BMC from the host without authentication. And as such, we are forcing BMC to believe that traffic is coming from the host itself, while it's in fact coming from network. So we are pretty much
that's the server-side request forgery kind of flair aspect to this.
Yep. So we are pretty much manipulating trust in this case. So my honest opinion, even when you communicate with Redfish from the host itself, there should be authentication instead of no authentication. But oh well. Maybe it breaks compatibility if they added, but yeah, the real fix would be to not even have this authenticate yourself. Like, even if they patch everything perfectly, what might happen is that somebody might be accessing this from host. By default, it's turned off though. So yeah. To turn it on, you need root privileges. So you already need to be pretty darn high in host hierarchy. But in this case, we manipulate it from the network to trust that it's on, and the traffic is coming from it.
Right. So it trusts it whether it's turned on or not. It still accepts requests from that IP address.
Very much so.
In a forged header, right?
Yep.
Let's talk about the we have some example exploit code, and I use the term exploit code almost with like a caveat because it's really just an HTTP request with the forged header with the correct values in the JSON request to create an account is the one that you constructed, Vlad.
Yes, pretty much that. Do note that you want to remove the port. So port is normally 443. I don't remember why this one has 8443, but doesn't really matter. So this specific, well, POC, I wouldn't really call it a fully weaponized exploit. So it
I
will
agree.
create an account. So Redfish allows you to create accounts inside of the BMC, and once you have the account, you can log in into BMC. So we pretty much
Right.
got admin access to BMC.
And you'd log in via
So
the web interface that is on the BMC network interface.
yep. So if exploited by its own, you get as much access as an administrator would when he has BMC access. Everything administrator can do, attacker can do as well from it, right? But if you combine it with previous two bugs, like part 2 ones, it's pretty
Mm-hmm.
much combines with part 2 code upload, I think. I do believe it was in part 2. So there was a bug which allows you to pretty much upload some code to the BMC to execute as root on the chip. Well, if you use that bug with this one, you will get full code execution on the chip.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, in this case on its own, it's already pretty dangerous because full BMC access, well, it already allows you to pretty much reinstall the operating system. So it's as complete a compromise as you can hope for.
Right. Yeah, there was a different BMC technology that I encountered on a pen test several years ago, and it was using a default password for the BMC. And when I logged in, an administrator was already logged in as root from the virtual console inside the BMC, right? So a lot of BMCs will give you that virtual console, right? Because if your operating system is borked, that's a technical term, and you need to access the operating system and you're not anywhere near it, you can log into the BMC and go give me basically a TTY, a terminal session with the
Yep.
operating system. And this one had already been logged in as root. So simply by having the BMC credentials, I was root on the operating system side.
Yeah. So in this case, I don't know if it will give you that straight away, but you certainly can do a lot of things like reboot the system and then connect to TTY and maybe manipulate grab. So this is a simple idea, right? So there is a lot attacker can get access to from this. So there can be further magic to get to the OS. I never tested if it actually gives you logged in TTY. Maybe it does. That one we will need to check.
Mm.
But anyways, I would imagine that manipulating grab might not be that difficult to actually give you that shell anyways.
Yeah, you could manipulate bootloaders at that point from the
Yeah,
BMC.
bootloaders or just get the grab to just drop to BNSH, like
Mm-hmm.
the default grab trick where you actually modify its boot parameters and you get into an SH console instead of say
Right,
GUI.
right.
Just apply this to a server and maybe it will help you.
I
So
gotcha.
there is a lot that might happen there.
So the impact is pretty. I mean, it's pretty high privileged access the attacker would gain if
Yup.
one were to compromise a BMC.
Yup. To be honest, it's even probably more privileged than root access because like you also get access to configure BIOS. Like
Mm-hmm.
AMI Megarac allows you to configure BIOS, so attacker can. You can disable secure boot. No need
Right.
to no need to bypass secure boot anymore. So there is
You can just go
quite
turn
a
it off
bunch.
through the BMC. Yeah.
You can just turn it off very much, or you can mount a folder remote. Like it does have ability to mount remote network folder to a server, which may or may not allow you further exploits of whatever is in the server. So like
Right.
this will depend on your use case. So there is quite a lot attacker can do with this actually, even
Right. And
without getting code execution on it.
and you've described scenarios in the past where you can put the server in kind of this infinite loop. I'm not suggesting
Yep.
people do this. This is really bad. Vlad had his
So
evil. We used to call it the evil hat, right? Vlad had his evil hat on one day.
so yeah, like one day I got an ask that somebody was telling, I don't even remember who it was, like, hey Vlad, one of the people we talked to, they claim that this vulnerability is not scary to them because they have full network monitoring. And like if somebody tries to ring out to home, we will detect it. And I was like, okay, hold my beer. And I created using part 2 vulnerabilities, which allow code upload, a dump archive that if you upload to the BMC, will put it into an infinite reboot loop. So it will just start executing on the BMC chip once every 10 seconds a piece of code which will tell the host to turn off. Like, I didn't actually shut down the BMC interface itself, so theoretically this one exploit you can patch, but it's not very difficult to modify web server configuration to also block all incoming traffic.
Right.
And then modify IPMI configuration to not allow access of legitimate administrator, reset passwords for everything. So pretty much lock myself in onto the chip and make it really, really hard to get myself out. So in
Right.
theory, if I would be truly evil, I would create a full POC which would ban all access sans reflashing the chip using a physical programmer.
Is that
So
possible in software you can prevent Flash programmer access to the chip?
no, like this would be the
Oh,
only way
okay.
to patch me out.
That would be
Like,
the only way. I got yeah, okay.
so like you would have to, in one server, it's not very hard. You can actually buy it and just patch it. But imagine doing this for a whole data center.
Right.
That would be not a
Right.
very fun day.
Yep. Yeah, that's
So
certainly a big impact and very scary.
That
yeah,
really
but in
speaks to
this,
the overall like leverage of these supply chain sort of foundational attacks, is that
yeah,
not only are you getting an enormous amount of access and impact on any given device where you compromise the BMC, but the places where the BMCs are is in like the IT infrastructure. It's a fundamental, component of data centers, any sort of like high performance computing environment, or big enterprises that are running their own infrastructure. So it's like that, such an enormous part of the risk represented by
yep,
these supply chain attacks is the multiple layers of huge leverage that it can provide against a
yep,
target.
yep, yep. The only saving grace in this case is that we don't really have a code upload this time, so we only get normal BMC account, so you cannot really make a infinite reboot loop with this unless like part 2 is not patched. But also B, like this attack needs only one request to the BMC from anywhere, from the host, from another BMC, from admin's laptop. So you realistically just need to get to the BMC. So then it'll just stay and not communicate. So all of your network EDRs will not really see anything because there is nothing going over the network. Like there is nothing to see. So that's pretty much the conjecture here.
Yeah, it's important. Talk network design for a moment, right?
Yep.
Because we did find that there were just over 1,000 of these exposed to the internet. Now,
Yep.
could you tell whether those were vulnerable or not, or it's hard to decipher if they're vulnerable to part 1, part 2?
So like the only way to tell if they're vulnerable to BMC&C part 1, part 2, part 3 is if you like two ways. You can log into BMC and check their version number and check vendor advisories, and if this version number is patched. And option 2, pretty much try to exploit the said vulnerabilities. So obviously I cannot log in on random devices on the internet, but also I kind of don't want to exploit BMC part 3 or part 2 to check if they're vulnerable.
Right.
So like I know that there are 1,000 of them for sure. I suspect it would be like 4,000 or 5,000 if I actually did the deeper scan. So only like it's not so easy to detect them because like vendor run stuff. Like I did check by page title, but I know for certain that page title sometimes gets changed by vendors. So I would suspect that we can find like three, 4 times more BMCs exposed straight to the internet. And just to be clear, it's not that there are 4,000 vulnerable servers only. It's 4,000 servers which are exposed directly to the internet with management interface, which is by far not the normal setup for this. So I suspect there are millions of servers, in fact, which are just inside data centers, etc., etc. So
Yeah,
they're just hidden.
the advice is always to not expose these to the internet because that's the
Yep.
worst case scenario.
Yep.
When you have it not exposed to the internet, we still recommend that you do network segmentation to only allow your administrators or VPN access right to this because of the
Yep.
high privileges if an attacker were to
Yep.
get on the system.
Yeah, this is a golden attack for nation state attackers, pretty much.
Mm.
Like hands down, nation state attackers like will probably love it the most because like if you compromise a large data center, you have a really stealthy persistence with this.
Yeah, because
So,
there's not a lot of we don't have a lot of visibility into the BMC
yep,
components, right?
yep, very much that. You can stay there for years undetected.
Yeah, because there's no EDR on your BMC chip.
Yep, yep. And like they don't actually need to create an account. Like this bypass provides them full access to Redfish, so they don't really need to create accounts to have some impact on the BMC from the box. So you might not be able to just, oh, hey, there is no account on this BMC. Probably nobody exploited this network. Well, they might be hiding on like one BMC using part two exploit and just spreading around the network and controlling it without making any
Right.
persistent accounts on all others. Or if they exploit the code upload, there will be no account created. Like you can just bypass authentication and straight out upload the code, and that's it. You're not going to see it.
Right. Even with just part 3, you don't necessarily have so you don't have to create an account. You have access to the Redfish API, which makes available endpoints that would allow you to change the configuration of the BMC, correct?
Very much that. Change the configuration and much more. But actually, with code execution, like with combining this with part 2 vulnerability, you can actually fry the CPU, like quite literally. There was research, I don't remember who posted it, where they
Yeah, it was
actually
like
applied.
early 2023, I think that paper came
Yeah,
out.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, they
Yeah.
supplied like 2.7 volts to a Xeon CPU. It obviously didn't quite like this many volts. So, like, yeah, you can actually fry the CPU with this too.
Yeah,
So,
I read that research. That was horrifying that they proved an attacker could cause
yep.
permanent damage to the
Yeah,
hardware.
yeah, and what they were pretty much describing was having root access to a BMC chip. Part 2 plus part 3 will give you root access to a BMC chip.
Right.
So we pretty much are in the right spot.
Yeah, and this to Chase's point too. This affects many servers, right? Because
Yeah,
Megarac is pretty widespread. A lot of folks don't, from a supply chain perspective, don't want to necessarily maintain, their own firmware. I mean, we have OpenBMC, and many vendors do customize OpenBMC, but I liken it to basically managing your own Linux distribution, right? It's kind of like Linux from scratch at that point. You get a full build system and you can customize Linux. So that requires a lot of management and maintenance and dependency management, right? Because the builds will pull in a number of dependencies as well. And that can be a bear to manage for sure.
yep,
My
yep,
skin is
yep.
crawling. Also, when you say manage your own Linux distro and all of that stuff, it's like the likelihood of that also introducing vulnerability.
Yes,
It's
exactly.
like there's such a narrow supply chain. Like it's like the headwaters, the number of folks that are making making BMC firmware and stuff is very small compared to the number that are using it. And
Yes.
so the likelihood, it's so good that AMI is good to work with and is like
Yeah,
issuing these patches and is giving
yep,
realistic risk
yep.
scores. Like that is such a stamp of approval for them that they're like that.
Yep.
But the
Yeah,
amount
we don't
of
often get a CVSS score of 10.0.
yeah,
Yep.
that's
And like
huge. And for them to acknowledge that
vendors,
themselves is like, yeah, big deal.
yep, vendors usually try to do everything to lower the score, even if it
Mm-hmm.
is detrimental to the vulnerability. For obvious reasons, they don't want to get issues with their own customers. But like, yeah, AMI actually owned up to all of this, so they pretty much did a score of 10 without much pushback. Like, obviously, we did provide POC to them, but still, like, you
Mm-hmm.
can try to argue that it is a lower score, so they didn't. So, and they actually patched it pretty darn quickly.
They did,
So,
yeah.
like, when vendors are already releasing patches 3 months into the process, and considering how high up they are in supply chain, that's awesome. Like, they
Yeah.
actually went ahead and informed people and got people to actually fix it, which is also amazing. Like,
Huge
Yeah,
respect to
which is,
them
I
for
mean,
that.
in
But also, like,
go ahead, Chase.
it's still going to take a while for those patches to make their way into the actual end user. And
Correct.
probably the sort of end users, the data centers and stuff are still going to be frustrated about it, which is a bummer for like AMI to be doing
yep,
such a stellar job as a vendor and still when, the patch makes its way through the the vendor and eventually like into the sort of end user that's buying from those
Yep.
vendors, they're going to be like, oh man, this downtime, I got to patch this thing. It's still going to be a difficulty for them or a hurdle for them to cross. And that's, I don't know if that's how you address that challenge in the overall supply chain, but
So
yeah, props to AMI, but also sorry to everybody who still is going to have to
Yeah.
deal with it downstream.
there is one silver lining. You might not necessarily need to even reboot your server. You just need to patch the BMC itself. Maybe the server can keep running. So if that's the case, you will not really have a downtime that will impact your customer. So
Yeah, that's true. And that's implementation
potentially
specific,
thing.
Vlad?
That might be implementation specific. Like I can see,
Yeah.
like for example, one of the challenges that I faced with making the infinite reboot implant, if the BMC starts sending signals to host too early, BMC will crash. So there are like kinks in that communication.
Mm-hmm.
I would assume that depending on how BMC is implemented, it might or might not be possible to reboot it separately from the host. But AMI does have a cold reset button in the BMC, which will reboot the BMC, and usually doesn't take the host with it. It just comes
Yeah, I
back up.
gotcha.
So
And that's
like
a hardware switch?
no idea. It's not a hardware switch, it's in the UI.
Oh, okay. Yep.
So how you would patch it is normally through the BMC itself. So if it is already compromised, you might get a surprise, where the patch
Mm-hmm.
will get uploaded but not get applied. But
Right.
if you provide an exploit, you can test it afterwards, like did it get patched or not.
Mm-hmm.
If you patch your server as per vendor instructions, and then suddenly you don't get the patch deployed, like it reboots, it tells it it's patched, but suddenly it's still exploitable.
Yep.
Maybe you want to contact us because you might have a case of infection in this case. Like
Yeah.
something
It
actually is not right there.
it's one reason why I wanted to include as many details as possible, right? And we run this double-edged sword, right? The more details we publish
Yeah.
about this particular vulnerability as an example, yes, the more information attackers have, but the more information defenders have, right? And I wanted to make sure that
Yep.
we included these details so that defenders and other cybersecurity companies, quite frankly, could help everyone, right? Help the entire industry
Yep.
by developing detections, by improving the scans for it. By we published which Lua file the vulnerable code was in, with a snippet of the vulnerable code, in addition to a proof of concept. I like the proof of concept exploit, right? So that you can test and validate your own systems. You could conceivably look inside of the firmware and determine if it has that Lua file and if that code, hasn't been updated. So we've provided the details for that to happen, which I'm excited about.
Yep. Like for part 1, part 2, we decided not to publish because they were very deadly. Like
Yes.
literally very deadly. So, but in this case, we don't really have code execution. So at the very least, like if you don't publish part 2 one which allows code execution, it's at least something. So yeah, because like it's
Yeah,
at
it's a
least does
fine
not allow
line.
you to, yeah, it does not allow you to fry hardware at the very least.
Right,
So
right.
so risk profiles are is a little bit milder.
Yeah. Let's talk about defense for a moment. Obviously we talk about patching already. If there's a patch available, you need to apply it. Obviously, you need to schedule that. Even if you believe you can do it independent of the operating system, those of us that have been in IT and security for a long time have been burned by applying an update. Like, this shouldn't impact this, but then as we know, sometimes it does, right? And so I get the hesitation of updating firmware like this, especially on your systems.
So yeah, what I would do is network segmentation. Like you need to segment your BMCs into a separate network, and you should also ban traffic in between BMCs. Like there is no reason one BMC should be talking to another. Like it's not
That's
a
a great
thing.
point. Yeah,
So
that's a
like
great point. Yep.
if you just block this traffic, it will be much harder for attackers to spread. Like they would need a specific vantage point which has access to all of the BMCs, which is supposed to be your automated management system, and that's supposed to be the only thing that actually is able to access all of them. Maybe your admin can also access them, but still that limits the attack surface by a lot. Like you need to be on a specific system or a specific admin laptop instead of just anywhere on a BMC or on any host with the access to a BMC. So second of all, I would probably work with AMI to check if it is possible to disable IPMI, and if it is possible to disable host interface entirely, so that like if you are a data center and you don't really want to provide your customers with access to root on the host, any access to the BMC, you might wanna be able to disable those interfaces. This would be my recommendation. So that like
where does IPMI come into play in this scenario, Vlad?
so IPMI is a way to log into BMC once you exploited Redfish. Just another way to use it. That's pretty much it.
Yeah,
Like through IPMI,
it's the older version of Redfish, essentially, right? It's a protocol that allows you to manage your BMCs.
Yeah. So the point here to actually enable host interface in a BMC, what you would do is run a specific IPMI command, and the host interface comes up. And afterwards, your host, if you have root access to it, will be able to access the BMC. So like there are really just make the host interface come up, allocate an IP address for yourself, and you can pretty much ping it and get to Redfish. So if you disable IPMI and disable host interface, there will be really no way to get to the BMC from the host so easily.
I see. Yeah. Lock that access down.
Yeah, attacker might still try to do shenanigans with implanting the BIOS and get into the BMC through the BIOS, but like that's a much harder hurdle for the attacker. Like if attacker has root access on the host, he can probably get access to it, but let's not make it a 5-minute task. Let's make it a firmware implant task.
No, I agree. Anything we can do to inconvenience the attackers is worth doing, right? Raising that bar, make them jump through more hoops, essentially.
Yep. And if you kill traffic in between BMCs, even if they get to this one, they're not spreading to your network.
So, yeah, I like that, and that's usually a switch configuration, right?
Very much
that determines if a host on that particular VLAN can talk to each other, right?
Yep. And while the first part might be harder to do, the network management is not that difficult. Like what you do is just apply a strict allow list to whomever can access the hosts, and like do this on the top of the switch or your router or whatever is giving whatever is managing your management network. So just ban traffic in between BMCs, and that will help you a lot. And you're not going to risk anything, because this traffic is not supposed to exist in the first place.
Right. I agree. Have you looked at what the logging is like? Like, do I get a log if someone created a new account via Redfish?
I didn't check it. We can check. This can be homework for us. But in this case, like honestly, I wouldn't rely on the logging, because like if attacker does exploits part 2, you're not gonna get any logs whatsoever.
Yeah. No. Agree completely.
Also, attacker might elect to pretty much reconfigure your BMC without making an account. So
correct. Yeah. So you can't rely on. I mean, monitoring the logs is good, but it carries with it that baggage and limitations of logging that we all have. Right. It's just the nature of the beast. An attacker with enough access can manipulate logs.
Yep. Unless you call them off really regularly out of the BMC, it's not going to give you like a lot of help. And really regularly, I mean, if attacker gets code execution, it's within seconds. So I wouldn't rely too much on the logs in this case.
Yeah, I mean, ideally you're using syslog to get those logs off to another system, right? But if the attackers are very crafty, they're killing the syslog functionality as soon as they get in, right?
Yep, and like in this case, I would suggest like monitoring. You can check if there are any unexpected accounts in your BMCs. Like Redfish allows you to list all of the accounts, and you are supposed to know what accounts you need. Like if you have some automated monitoring system access in the BMC, you are supposed to know what account will it have, and you can ask BMC, oh, hey, list me all of accounts, and if you suddenly find hacker in there or some unexpected account that's not in your list, that's immediate suspicion that somebody exploited this against you. or
Right.
something similar.
Independent of logs, you can query the Redfish API to get
Yep.
information about what's happening on the BMC. Yeah, I like that a
Yeah,
lot.
again, it will not detect you everything, but at the very least, it will detect dumb attackers.
Right,
So,
right. Yeah, that's interesting. I suggested also we might want to consider putting a WAF in front of our BMCs, in front of Redfish. Not sure how feasible that is.
so in this
Obviously,
case,
that comes with baggage too, right? When we talk about
yeah,
WAFs and bypasses, but
WAF is probably not going to be much of a help. Consider that this chip is very limited in resources, so you might not want to run too much on it.
Right, or putting it in line could be tricky from a network perspective too.
Yep. In this case, like I don't think that running the WAF on the chip itself is such a great idea, to be honest.
Yeah, no, it would probably be super difficult to run run anything on the BMC
Well,
itself. I mean, do users have the capability to run programs on their BMCs? Usually
No.
not, right? I mean,
No.
it is what it is, right?
No, it's something that AMI will need to supply you.
Right. It's something we've talked about in the context of security and network appliances, is having better capability and visibility into these systems so that we can do defensive activities such as run agents and get telemetry
Yep,
and stuff like
very
that.
much that. Very much that.
That was something that you mentioned, Paul, in your sort of in our discussions about the Pacific Rim situation, is that they made kind of an unprecedented move of providing really deep visibility and access into the inner workings of their gear for the purposes of monitoring that, that attack campaign.
The irony of that all too is that attackers are doing that.
Yeah.
If you look at the recent stories of Juniper malware, right? They had the CDOR, the old backdoor code that they had ported and maintained. And then the recent one is Tiny Shell, which Tiny Shell has been used by attackers for a backdoor for quite some time. I saw articles that reference it was like FreeBSD under the covers of there was two levels similar to some of the Cisco line of products, right? There's the Juniper command line interface, but then you can go a step deeper and get into the underlying operating system, which I believe in Juniper's case, at least for some of their products, was FreeBSD. In Cisco's case, it's Linux. And, I've mentioned that there are backdoors that have been publicly available for a long time, and attackers are basically porting it to this architecture to run their attacker tools on it. So the attackers are utilizing the platform, but we as the end consumers of these devices, we can't. I want to be able to run some kind of software on my Linux systems, right? But I can't on these because it's locked down. But yet the attackers are doing it with their tools.
Yep.
Mandiant was the one that sort of disclosed some stuff about that most recent Juniper attack that was using the Tiny Shell, and they specifically called that out in their post about it. They said, I've got the quote in front of me. They said that their investigation into UNC 3886's activities was hampered by the challenges inherent in analyzing proprietary network devices, which require novel methods for artifact acquisition and analysis. And they also noted that the group routinely targets network and edge devices, which typically lack security monitoring tools like endpoint detection and response. So it's like the attackers know that we lack under monitored, right? They're under secured, and that the vendor's not giving you the visibility that you want. And they're like, well,
here we are.
So I suspect that novel methods they're speaking about would be pretty much breaking into the device, but they put it a little bit more diplomatically, I guess. So let's not call them out on this. Maybe they're speaking about something else. Maybe
they either leveraged the same exploit that the attackers did, or they had a spy flash programmer and pulled an image for forensics, or both, right?
Yeah, or they had a whole conference with the vendor to have some kind of access to this thing.
Right, so, that's a third possibility for sure.
So it's definitely but it's definitely not a easy way to collect it. You don't get to easily acquire forensics images in this case.
Right. These are the I was coming up with thinking about slogans for the show. We talk about the dark corners of the internet, right? These things we're describing are the dark corners of your enterprise network, and that's where attackers are going after.
This is not a dark corner. This is a red corner.
Yeah, it can be. It's very interesting. So I think in summary, definitely, look at patches and good network segmentation and networks. Basically, traditional network security is what we're talking about in the context of BMCs. VPN access, not putting it on the internet, and locking down from a network perspective, in lieu of a patch. Some level of monitoring, whether that be logs or management via Redfish, using the management facilities to collect telemetry, is what we have at our disposal today. Awesome.
Yes, very much so.
Anything else on this particular vulnerability?
So I would say this covers it pretty well. So I don't think there is much to add there. So yeah, covered everything.
We did add a detection for this in our product.
Yes.
Chase, I don't know. We just put that out. It's actually in the blog post.
Yes.
I'm assuming we can do interrogation from the host side of the BMC, right? That we talked about in order to pull the version of that BMC, and then we have the database to know if that version you're running is vulnerable or not. I'm fairly certain that that was one method that we discussed.
Yes. Yes. So we did detect it over a network using pretty much novel methods to detect it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and over the network too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like it's actually
Oh, go ahead, Vlad.
it's actually very tricky to detect it not over the network but from the host. Like from the host, you would need to enable the host interface, which might lead to unintended consequences. So it's not very safe. But over network, if you are sitting in the same network, you can actually scan it.
Right.
So yeah, we'll probably follow up and add previous versions as well of it.
You pulled a list of like 1,000 of these interfaces that are in fact exposed to the internet from Shodan. So if you think you might have some of the a Megarac management interface exposed to the internet, there's about 1,000 of those out there on Shodan. Yeah, go check Shodan.
Yeah.
It takes costs virtually nothing to go search Shodan to make sure that's not you. Maybe they're honeypots. I don't know.
Yeah, like
there could be. I mean, it's fair. It's a fair point. I mean, probably not all of them, right? But
yeah,
some of them likely are.
1,000 people have a Megarac honeypot out there, but
right.
Yeah, so some of them might be a honeypot, not gonna deny it. And this is also the reason why I didn't even want to test it. Like getting the exploit to attackers early would not be very fun.
Right. Yeah, there's limits for sure. I mean, the CFAA is a thing. We're not out to violate that, but yeah. I mean, I don't want to be the internet police, but I almost want to find a way to reach out to whoever owns all 1,000 of those. Give them a warning.
Well, you can break in and leave them a
message, right? That is also frowned upon. I believe there was an attack against printers, right? And they were printing out messages like, "Hey, your printer is vulnerable." Still very much frowned upon, right?
Yeah. So like,
technically a crime, sort of a Robin Hood scenario.
It is very much a Robin Hood scenario. Yeah. So
yeah. So if you really want to make somebody go mad, just attack their printer and ask it to print I'm a piece of paper at 9 a.m. every single day.
Right. There are ways to get people's attention, but we don't condone such activities. But
outside of trolling, we don't. Don't worry, we don't do it. It's not us.
If you do that, it'll run out of its DRM'd ink cartridge, and like
that's right. And
the financial consequences will be devastating.
Devastating.
Yeah.
Well, Vlad and Chase, thank you so much for appearing on this episode of Below the Surface. Thanks everyone for listening and watching. We'll see you next time.